Well, good morning. And I was going to say Merry Christmas because now we're past Thanksgiving. So like Abby said, I feel like we can celebrate now without you like throwing things at me from the seats. But, so bring on the twinkling lights, the candy canes, the cars dressed up like reindeer, the sweaters that should like never be worn, and of course like Christmas shopping, right? Okay, so we're going to do a little informal poll here this morning. There's no judgments, okay? But how many of you have started Christmas shopping? Hands. Okay. Now, full disclosure, I can only see about like 3 of you, so it's fine. But how many of you have finished Christmas shopping? Anyone yet? Anyone? Okay, there was 1 in the first service. So you guys, that is a big deal. How many of you are thinking, why would I have even started? Because it's not even Christmas Eve yet, and that's when you go Christmas shopping. Anyone? Okay, there was 1 in the first service too. So I see you, Dusty. I see you. But I know I talk about my mom pretty much in every talk I give, but it's because she's a good sport and she knows how much I love her and she really, truly doesn't mind. Okay, but if you are like my mom, maybe you bought things already and now you're thinking, where did I put that thing that I bought, right? But it happens every Christmas. We will be opening presents and I'll be watching my mom and she's looking like this. And then we get done at, we've opened up everything. And then she goes, and you're like, what? What is it? And she's like, well, she didn't see us open something that she knows she bought us. So either she didn't bring it with her to our house or she doesn't remember wrapping it. Like something is always lost, okay? Something is always lost, which is fine because sometimes it ends up being like this Christmas present you get in the middle of January in the dead winter of Indiana, and that's fine too. I'm okay with that. But every year there is something that is lost. She always finds it though. That's the thing. That's the good part. She always finds it. But that is a good setup, and I think you'll agree with me once we kind of get through a couple of big concepts here for where we're going in this Christmas series, The World Turned Upside Down. But first, the Christmas story is all about a theological term that you may or may not have heard about called the incarnation. And you're thinking, ooh, big fancy church word, right? But what it really means is that we have a God who saw us wandering far away from him and took the initiative because he loves us so much to come from heaven to earth to be with us in the flesh. That's what it means, this big fancy church word you might have heard. But the next term, you may have heard God called Emmanuel, right? And I think we even sang about it in the very first song, which translates to God with us. Not just God like aware of us or like God sees us, literally God with us every day in the flesh. But through Jesus' human birth, his incarnation, we can see what his kingdom was really all about. It was about the lost being found. It was about the least being loved. It was about the lonely finding belonging. You guys, people found their purpose when he came from heaven to be with us on earth. The world literally turned upside down. And Christmas is just really a story of God searching for what is lost and finding it, like my mom with her Christmas presents, okay? The whole sum of Jesus' mission could really be summed up into one short verse right here. It says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost." And we find this theme of saving and seeking all throughout the Bible, but especially in Luke. And if you are not familiar with Luke, he was not originally a follower of Jesus. He was a doctor, and he was trying to figure out who this Jesus guy really was. Was he who he says he was, right? Like a lot of us, trying to figure out who Jesus really is. And in Luke's account of Jesus' teaching, he tells us in chapter 15 that Jesus invites a group of people to imagine that they are a shepherd. So, okay, imagine with me here. You are a shepherd, and you have 100 sheep, right? Which, so many, 100 sheep. And one of the sheep goes missing. So what would a shepherd do, he asks, right? Jesus reminds them back then what they already knew, which was that a good shepherd would leave the 99 and go search for the one missing sheep, and then they would celebrate its return. That isn't natural for us now, today. If we had 100 sheep and one went missing, we would probably do the Midwestern, like, oh, guess it's gone. Like, I still have 99 other sheep, and that is still so many. Like, one, that's okay. But in the first century, though, if you were wealthy enough to own 100 sheep, you probably also had people who worked for you, right? So the big deal in this story is that he didn't send a delegate. He didn't volunteer one of his people to go find that lost sheep. The shepherd went himself, because he's not simply God aware of us, he's God with us. He's Emmanuel. And a few verses later in that same chapter, Luke goes on to tell us a story about a woman who has 10 coins. Each are worth an entire day's worth of work, and she loses one, as one does sometimes. But Jesus rhetorically asks, like, won't she turn on the lights and sweep the entire house to find the missing coin? And of course she would, right? She searches until she finds it. So a significant ongoing theme in Jesus' teachings is this: lost things matter. Therefore, they must be found, right? And how much more so when people are lost? You guys, he's relentless, okay? But one interaction shows us just how passionate Jesus is about this mission, and it is with a man named Zacchaeus. And if you grew up in church, you may have heard Zacchaeus' name, and the mention of Zacchaeus' name already has you singing a little tune in your head, right? Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Yep, I hear some of you, because he climbed up in a sycamore tree, right? Okay, if that is not familiar to you, count your blessings, right? Or go to YouTube later and Google it for like some sort of extra credit, but then don't blame me when that song is stuck in your head for all of eternity, okay? But Zacchaeus was a tax collector in a town called Jericho, and he's actually the chief tax collector. So in a time when Jericho was occupied by the Roman Empire, the people who lived in Jericho, including the Jewish people, were required to pay just an insane amount of taxes, right? So Zacchaeus, as the one who collected these taxes, was considered evil. Like, he was oppressive. He was someone who represented cooperation with these oppressive forces. And the too long, didn't read version of Zacchaeus is, one, nobody likes Zacchaeus, okay? And two, he represents everything that the Jewish people wanted freedom from. But enter Jesus into Zacchaeus' story, because as Jesus was approaching this town where Zacchaeus lives, news of his arrival way preceded him, right? Like, there was buzz about Jesus coming, and Zacchaeus wanted to be able to see him because he was a wee little man, right? He climbed up in this tree so he could see. But Luke tells it this way. He says, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. I love this part of the story, honestly, because Jesus sees Zacchaeus up in the tree, first of all, and he is like, get down. Why are you up there? And then he just invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house. Like, that's the normal thing that people do. Like, so classic, right? But first, like today, you don't invite yourself over to somebody else's house. Zacchaeus should have been inviting Jesus over to his house, but that's not what happened, because hospitality back then was such a huge deal. But second, Jesus was a rabbi, right? He's this holy man, and Zacchaeus is this sinner, this evil man. So Jesus is putting his reputation on the line, because people are now looking at Jesus like, is he really the Messiah? Because he is hanging out and associating with this sinner. But finally, Jesus was Jewish, and he would have seen Zacchaeus as a collaborator with the enemy. The implications of this are huge, you guys. It would have been like you leaving here today and going to lunch with someone who is a known terrorist. And you might be thinking, okay, Allison, that's a bit extreme. But that's true. Like, that's what we're talking about. This was a big deal, his interaction with Zacchaeus. So all of this is very atypical. But Zacchaeus welcomes Jesus with enthusiasm. He's like, come on over. But what happened is that Jesus found Zacchaeus. But here is the thing. I doubt if Zacchaeus even realized he was lost. So let me repeat that. Jesus found Zacchaeus, but I doubt that Zacchaeus even realized he was lost. There's a story in the news a while back about a woman who was reported missing. She had gone on this bus tour to a volcanic canyon in Iceland, and the bus driver was responsible for making sure that everyone who went to this volcano returned back to the bus, right? So after an hour, when this woman hadn't returned, they called the police. Search party was started to go look for her. Teams of volunteers searched and searched and searched. But after 12 hours, the search party was called off when they realized that the lost woman had actually joined the search party. You guys... In a case of a little miscommunication, as you might say, the woman didn't realize that she was the one that everyone was looking for, right? Which makes me wonder a lot of things, but is it possible that we could be the lost person and not even realize it? Is it possible that we might even be in the search party and still be the lost that God is looking for? So what does it mean to be lost? Like, what kind of person is Jesus looking for when he said he came to seek and save the lost? Because it might not be or look like exactly what you're thinking. So we're going to use a few images here this morning to maybe just talk about what it looks like when we hear Christians talk about being lost. So we think of something that looks like this oftentimes. The Christians are the ones who are found or saved. They're on the inside of this circle, while those who are still lost are on the outside of the circle. And the circle represents this decision, that one-time decision that we make to become a Christian. There's certain ideas that we agree to. And this one-time decision to accept Jesus into your heart is the concept that I believed this image until I was probably in college or even older, honestly, because this is still the concept that comes to mind for a lot of Christians talking about the lost, people who never made that one-time decision to follow Jesus. But what if this next diagram is a little more accurate way of thinking about what Jesus had in mind when he came to seek and save the lost? What if it's the found are those moving closer or towards that cross, towards Jesus, and those who are moving away from Jesus are actually getting lost? What if it's more about the direction your feet are pointed and going instead of that one-time decision? What if it's an everyday decision to move towards Jesus, a journey instead of a destination, if you will? What if lost is actually the description of anyone who's moving away from Jesus, those who have their feet pointed in a direction leading them down a path that does not lead to Jesus and what he wants for their life? And what if those who are found are people moving toward Jesus, every day waking up and choosing to learn more about him, to love others, to just move towards who he is? This kind of changes the whole idea of Jesus' mission to seek and save the lost, for me anyways, and I hope it does for you as well, because it's more about the direction that your life is going merely than a one-time decision that you've made. And I believe it's truer to what we see in the story of Zacchaeus as well, because Zacchaeus was lost. His life was off track, right? So Jesus sought him out and reoriented his entire life. And as the story progresses, Zacchaeus demonstrates this radical reorientation of his life, so much so that he stands up at the dinner that Jesus invited himself to, and he says this, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." This pledge goes way beyond what was actually required repayment of theft back then. It's a repentance. And sometimes if you've been in church or maybe even, outside, you've heard people talk about repent or repentance, and it's always this, like repent, da-da-da-da. It's always very finger wagging, like negative thing. And but it really just means like about face, to turn and go in a different direction. It's not this, finger wagging kind of thing. It's a total reversal of the trajectory of Zacchaeus' life. And he was moving away from Jesus, and now he's moving towards Jesus in a different direction. But he's not doing it because he feels guilty or he didn't want to repay back the money just because to make himself feel better. This was Zacchaeus saying, I recognize that I have been doing my own thing, and now I want to do the Jesus thing. I want to make Jesus the center of my life, so I'm going to go in a different direction. But Jesus confirms all of this for Zacchaeus in the next verse. He said, today, salvation has come to this house, because this man, too, is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus sees the change in Zacchaeus, and based on his new trajectory of his life, declares that he has led his family to salvation. He is now a Christ follower. Jesus calls Zacchaeus the son of Abraham. And for someone who wasn't Jewish, this is huge, you guys. Jesus is restoring Zacchaeus' whole identity. Jesus came to seek and save the lost, and that's what he's done for Zacchaeus and his family, and for us. See, lost can be a descriptor of anyone who is moving away from Jesus. And when we understand the story of Zacchaeus, we can think of people we know who are lost, right? It might be a friend, family member, coworker, neighbor who is far from God, and you want them to find their way back to God because you also believe that lost things matter. Or maybe you're listening to this, and for the first time, like Zacchaeus, you're thinking, I think maybe I'm spiritually lost. And I'm so glad that you're here at Bridgeway specifically, because this is a place where you can have your feet pointed toward Jesus while still asking a lot of questions, while still working through your doubts, while still trying to figure out what your faith looks like. Or maybe you're someone today who has been a person of faith for a very long time, and now you're thinking, I think I've been lost. Like maybe without even knowing it, I am off track. Because this is a good time then to examine the person and the priorities and the practices of Jesus so that you can move toward him every single day. You guys, no one wakes up and decides they want to be lost. No one intends to be lost. You just don't. It just doesn't work that way. No one thinks, I want to be lost today. For example, my friend Jackie and I, we go on lots of different trips to Indiana wineries, which means we have been to the top of the state, all the way to the bottom of the state, and every back road and bridge and everything in between, okay? And a lot of these wineries are kind of in the middle of nowhere, and that's fine because we have GPS, right? We are not Lewis and Clark, neither one of us, and so God gave us GPS, and so we are using that thing every single time. And so we type in the address and we are off, right? It is by this lake. It's supposed to be by this lake in southern Indiana. And so we are going around and we stop when our GPS says that we have arrived, and we look around and we are literally at the dead end. We are at a dead end road, and the GPS shows us in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantic Ocean, you guys. Like, what? We are in Cornfield, Indiana, Atlantic Ocean. So clearly, we had to reroute, right? Reroute, because this is not where we had intended to go. But sometimes our decisions lead us to that dead-end road. And we don't even know how we got there. And that's sometimes the most dangerous place to be. Like maybe you woke up one day and you realize that you are in a tremendous amount of debt because you have been so busy keeping up with the Joneses and you don't know how you actually got there. Or maybe you have found yourself alone because you have cut yourself off from community and other people. But you didn't even realize in the moment that that is what you were doing. And now you're alone. We don't always know how we get to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, okay? But sometimes we find ourselves there. But there is good news for you, and there's good news for me as well. Sorry, Chris. Sorry, sound guy. Jesus wants to find us, okay? He's the GPS rerouting our direction and our lives. And Christmas is all about God showing up in Jesus to make sure that all that are lost are found. And being found and following Jesus means that we're moving closer and closer to the person, priorities, and practices of Jesus. But how does that happen? How do you move towards the person of Jesus? Maybe you're new to this whole faith God thing. So maybe for you, your step is a deep dive into the character and person of Jesus. Is he who he says he is? Is he trustworthy like I and other people have said that he is? Finding out for yourself. Maybe you grew up in church and so your faith has always been your parents' faith and you've just taken that along with you. Maybe it's time to figure out what your faith actually looks like. Maybe your next step is a public declaration of your faith, of what has been happening in your heart and in your life. Maybe it's just this outward expression of baptism, and we have this lovely little trough over here that you could take that next step in if that's your next step. But how do you move towards the priorities of Jesus? Well, you make his priorities your priorities. When he said God's kingdom come, God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that is what we are trying to do here at Bridgeway as well. We're trying to bring the up there down here and make Kokomo, Indiana, look more like heaven with our community impact, our partnerships with schools, lots of different things. But how can you do that as an individual as well to make your own piece of the world, your own part of your community look more like heaven? But how do you move towards the practices of Jesus? I feel like daily you have to begin to put those practices into place. It's prayer, it's loving others, it's even rest, you guys, and solitude, it's generosity. But you're a human being, okay? You're not a human doing. What? A human doing. But we say that a lot around here because you need to rest. You require it. We need to rest. We also need to be open-handed with our resources and be generous and actively love others around us, even when they might seem unlovable, because, spoiler alert, sometimes that's you too. And sometimes I know for sure it's me, okay? We did a series a while back where we talked about getting dusty, about following our rabbi, following Jesus so closely that when he walks and kicks up dust, it gets on us because we are following so closely behind him. What does it look like for you to get dusty and follow these practices of Jesus? Remember the stories I told you earlier about the shepherd and his 100 or 99 sheep, the woman who turned her house upside down to find that lost coin? Well, the third story in that chapter, Jesus tells us that it's often referred to as the greatest short story in all of literature, but it's about a man who had two sons, right? And the younger son told his father that he really was ready to leave home and he wanted his portion of the estate, which was weird back then, would be weird now to ask for your inheritance in advance, right? But he got it. And the text says that he went off to a distant country and squandered every single penny of his inheritance on wild living. So I'll let your imagination fill in the blanks and do the rest there. But he ends up broke and alone. and he found a job feeding pigs. And so he started to eat what the pigs were eating. And at his lowest of lows, he remembered that even his father's servants had actual meals to eat. So he decides to go back home so that way, hopefully, he can be a servant of his father's and at least get actual food to eat. So while he is still very far away, long off, the father sees him. And I love this part of the story because it says that the father runs to him. And this may not seem like a big deal, but back then, you guys, men didn't run because they would have had to hitch up his tunic while he's running and expose his bare legs. And back then it was shameful for men to show their bare legs. It was humiliating. But it says the father runs and throws his arms around his son and blankets him with kisses. The son had prepared this speech and didn't even get halfway through because it says this. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. I don't know your life. I don't know what you've done that may have you feeling like you're lost today. But that's our God, you guys. A God who runs to greet us when we decide to come back home. And it's never too late. You're never too far gone to come back home, to come back to God. He will run to you every single time. I recently heard a podcast on This American Life about a native Colombian marketing executive named Jose Miguel Sokoloff. His native country of Colombia had been embattled and war-torn for more than 50 years, and even more so now. But resulted in over 220,000 deaths, more than 5 million people being displaced. But they wanted, Colombia, the nation, wanted to do a marketing campaign. And so they approached Sokoloff with this interesting opportunity about creating a campaign to convince these young guerrilla rebels to come back home, to demobilize, to quit fighting, and come back, re-enter society. So in December 2010, Sokoloff ran an ad campaign called Operation Christmas. And at 9 strategic places throughout the jungle where rebels were known to travel, they strung hundreds of Christmas lights on 75-foot tall trees. And when the rebels walked by, a motion sensor set off the lights and a recorded message played saying, "If Christmas can come to the jungle, then you can come home." And amazingly, several hundred rebels put down their guns and returned home. The next year, they ran a similar campaign titled Operation Rivers of Light. The firm filled more than 7,000 translucent plastic balls with small gifts and heartwarming notes inviting the rebels to come home and place them in the river. The rebels, obviously you can see here, traveling by a river, saw these balls, could not resist, had to pick them up and figure out what the heck this was, right? But they received the gifts and read the messages, and several hundred rebels demobilized and returned home. Then, in 2012, the ad agency ran Operation Bethlehem, and there wasn't great pictures because you're talking lights in the jungle, right? But this time they shined huge skylights up into the night air and ran the following message. It said, "This Christmas, follow the light that will guide you to your family and your freedom." And one more time, hundreds of rebels stopped their fighting and came back home. At this point, there were peace talks going on, and this marketing ad campaign ad company is basically like working themselves out of a job, right? Their goal is to no longer have any rebels, and so this is normally a no-no for an ad agency, right? But they are working themselves out of a job because there are peace talks and negotiations. So they did one last campaign, and as a mom, this one hit me right in the feels, okay? So the campaign was called Mother's Voice, and it featured real-life stories of mothers whose children had been recruited to be guerrilla rebels. They shared snapshots of their children and recorded personal messages to them, asking them to consider coming home. And the campaign read, "Before you were a gorilla, you were my son." They wanted them to know that they could safely demobilize and take back their lives. They wanted them to know that while it may have looked like a dead end, they could reroute. They wanted them to know that if they were the one sheep, they would never stop looking for them. And they wanted them to know that they would run to them every single time, kill their fattened calf, and celebrate with them if they came home. That is what Christmas is, you guys. It's God's campaign that started more than 2,000 years ago, and every single day since, proclaiming to any of us who are lost that we can come